We are in Old Testament Survey Lesson 18 today. We are studying the Mishnah Torah, the Deuteronomy, the law repeated, the retelling of the law. The author of Deuteronomy is Moses, the man of God, and the occasion is in the wilderness, circa 1406 BC, as the Israelites are on the east of Jordan, preparing to cross the Jordan and enter the promised land after 40 years in the wilderness. The theme of the book is choosing life and blessing over death and cursing from God. So there are some key verses which I will invite you to turn and read in your Bibles, but just to make your lives easier, I will also put them up on the screen. And we're going to begin with Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 8. Deuteronomy 1:8. Let me move Kyle and Delich over here a bit, if it'll let me. Um, there we go. Oh, I have it up on the screen. I was just trying to make it bigger. Um, all the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do. Wait a minute. That's 8:1, not 1:8. There we go. It just did this. It just did it again. Okay. There. All right. Deuteronomy 1:8. Behold, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give unto them and to their seed after them. So, where was the first time that we saw the promise given to the patriarchs? It mentions Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When was the first time that we heard a promise made to Abraham or to the to Isaac or to Jacob? Genesis chapter 12. Very good. Genesis chapter 12. If we just change our direction, go to Genesis 12. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy father's kindred, and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Okay? So by the time that we are in Deuteronomy and we are in chapter 1 and we are looking at verse 8, behold, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give unto them and to their seed after them. By the shortest estimates of biblical scholars, this is 480 years later. By the longest of estimates, it would be over 700 years later. Okay? So, and I think it's closer to 600 than 700 or 480 or 470. But this promise has been a long time waiting from our perspective as humans, right? The Israelites waited to receive the promise that God had made to Abram for a really long time, for centuries. And yet, for some reason, the generation before this one came to Kadesh Barnea, was on the edge of the promised land, and turned around and walked away. It's heartbreaking if you think about it. Heartbreaking from our perspective as well as from God's perspective. So this generation, you know, most of them, though there are some older people among them, most of them were born in the wilderness. Most of them have no memories of living in Egypt. For 40 years, they've been in this desert. Everyone who was 20 years old and up are dead, except Moses and Aaron. And who was the other one, guys? Actually, no, I'm sorry. Caleb, Aaron has already died. Uh, Caleb died just in the latter part of Leviticus. My mistake. Uh, Moses and Joshua, and who is the last one who's still alive? Caleb, right? Caleb ben Hur. Caleb and Joshua are the only two of those three going over the river into the promised land. Okay. There are some people who are between the ages of 40 and 60, but I'm going to suggest there probably aren't that many. Life expectancy in this time, at the best of times, wasn't that great. So to survive until you were in your 50s, approaching 60, while living in a desert is probably rare. So I think it's likely that there aren't that many people between the ages of 41 and 60, but there's a few. And then you have Joshua and Caleb and Moses, who is going to shortly die by the end of this book. Okay? So the next theme verse is Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. We're going to spend some time talking about that later today, but you could summarize all the law of God in this one sentence. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Even the second greatest commandment, to love thy neighbor as thyself, is a natural outgrowth of obeying the commandment to love the Lord. And then another theme verse is Deuteronomy 12 and verse 8. Ye shall not do after all the things that we do here this day, every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes. So Joshua led the people through the Jordan River. The Israelites began to conquer the land. After a quarter of a century, Joshua dies, and the Israelites, under the time of the judges, do every man that which is right in his own eyes. Right? It's interesting that on the east side of the Jordan, on the edge of the promised land, on the edge of destiny, they were specifically warned not to do this very thing. Why does God have to say this? Why is it necessary to say, here's a list of commands from the God of the universe. Now that you have this, don't do every man whatsoever is right in your own eyes. Why is that even necessary? Yeah, because people are sinners born. People are rebels by nature. And we still have this problem in our world today where everyone says, well, just do what you think is right. Just do what feels right in your heart, right? Um, yeah. Whereas God says, whatever you do, don't do what you think is right. Do what God says is right. It's uh, it's interesting that we're still facing this dilemma, though, with Christians so many, nearly 35 centuries after the Israelites in the wilderness were told, ye shall not do after all the things that we do here this day, every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes. Okay, 27, Deuteronomy 27 and verse 9. And Moses and the priests, the Levites, spake unto all Israel, saying, take heed and hearken, O Israel. This day thou art become the people of the Lord thy God. This day thou art become the people of the Lord thy God. So what's so different between this day and yesterday? Haven't they been the people of the Lord since the days of Abram? Why is it different? Okay. Yeah, if we're being honest, yeah, if we're being honest, they have never been a people before. They went into Egypt as a family, then they became enslaved, and they've been Bedouins wandering around in the wilderness, and standing at the water's edge, God tells Moses to tell them, listen carefully to the voice of your God. Okay? Listen carefully. Understand, take heed, listen, hearken, O Israel. This is the day you stop being a wandering Bedouin community and you become a nation. You become a people. You are about to be a people with a possession. You understand, in order to be a nation, you basically must have three things. One, you must have people. Two, you must have land. And three, you must have government, right? God has given them, in the words of these books, not only religious law, moral law, but also a constitution. The law of Moses is the governmental contract, the societal contract of the Israelites. This is their Magna Carta. This is their constitution. Their system of government is spelled out in these pages. They've been given a government. They are a people, but they are not yet a nation until they actually put their feet on the promised land. So God says to them, "This day thou art become the people of the Lord thy God." I kind of wonder sometimes if we should preach this verse at every baptism. A child of God is about to become one of the people of God. It's yours by birth, it's yours by promise, but you haven't claimed it until you go through the water. It's all right. You can tell your friends I'm a heretic later. Um, ah, well, keep in mind, we're talking about an analogy between an Old Testament event and a New Testament event. So the analogy is never meant to be perfect. But for the Israelites, God said, "This day you go from being a wandering tribe to being a nation, a people," right? Um, for the child of God, you're a child of God essentially all alone until you join a church at baptism and join yourself to the people of God. The Israelites were going to do it by crossing the Jordan. We do it through baptism. Mm-hmm. Right. Hmm. So the last one is Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 19. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. Maybe maybe Christians should get bumper stickers that say choose life. Deuteronomy 30:19. Well, I know there are some in the pro-choice movement, um, or as I like to call it, the pro-death community, um, who will say that they do not believe that abortion is right and they would not have one or consent to one, but they do not believe it should be illegal. And I will confess, I think that argument generally is just not well thought through. Because if you begin to ask questions about why do you think it's wrong, why would you not do it, you very quickly end up at because you're killing a baby. Well, why do you think it should be legal to kill a baby? That's that's where I think a lot of times there's a disconnect is they they don't think it through clearly enough. So, introduction. Moses calls together a new generation of Israelites born mostly in the wilderness, fed from the very hand of God all of their lives, and battle tested against the Amorites and others to charge them to accept the gift of God which their parents and grandparents had spurned. The Hebrews called this the Mishnah Torah, meaning repetition of the instructions. God sets before the people life and death, and blessing and cursing, and he implores them to choose life. Moses preaches three public sermons in the first 26 chapters. All of them and the rest of the book take place on the eastern bank of Jordan. So it's interesting this morning, those of you who were in the first class of the day with me studying apologetics, we were talking about the atheistic argument about free choice in man, man's freedom being an argument against the existence of God, right? Um, Here's God's response to that. I've set before you a choice, and I'm asking you, choose life. The alternative is to choose death. I'm asking you to choose blessing. The alternative is to choose cursing. It is not true that I am absolutely free. Only God is. But I am sovereign enough to decide to make a decision as to right or wrong, which will I do. But I'm also a created being subject to the laws of the God of nature who created me, which means freedom doesn't mean that I am free from consequence, only that I am free to choose. But every choice brings consequences. Moses preaches 3 public sermons in the first 26 chapters. All of them and the rest of the book take place on the eastern bank of Jordan. Okay? So the first sermon is about the failure of the previous generation. But before I dive too much into that, um, let me pause to get your thoughts or your questions or your input on the introduction to the book. Right. Agreed. It's also important to realize that most of this generation was not there the first time around when Exodus and Leviticus and um, the laws and rules that are contained in them were given to the people. And even the ones who were there, that was 40 years ago, right? It was a long time. And some of them were very young. Yeah. Some of them were very, very young. Then again, 19 sounds pretty young to me these days. Um, so the first sermon is on the failure of the old generation, the generation that had come before. And that is Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 4, with chapter 4 primarily dealing with the consequences, if you will, of the disobedience of that generation. But if we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 1 and we just take a look at what Moses does, he calls them back to the last time they were at Kadesh Barnea. And he says, verse 1 of chapter 1, these be the words which Moses spake unto all Israel on this side Jordan, in the wilderness, in the plain, over against the Red Sea, between Paran and Tophel, and Laban, and Hazeroth, and Dijahab. There are 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spake unto the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him in commandment unto him. So, unto them, excuse me. This brings up an interesting question. There's little disagreement about who wrote Deuteronomy 34, right? Deuteronomy 34 records Moses' death. There's very little disagreement among Christians, theologians, Hebrews, rabbis. Most people agree that Joshua wrote Deuteronomy 34. But just something to think about, how much of Deuteronomy did Joshua write down? Not how much of it was inspired to him, how much of it did he write down? Because what we have here, almost almost every single word of this book is an account of Moses speaking out loud what God had told him to say to this generation of Israelites, right? So there's no question that the words are inspired through Moses because God told Moses to say them and he repeated them. Does it actually matter at what point in the book of Deuteronomy Joshua became the scribe? If it was chapter 1 or chapter 34 or somewhere in the middle? These are Moses' words. He spoke them. They were given to him by God. They were inspired by God. God told him what to say. It doesn't actually matter at what point Joshua took over the penmanship, right? But it's amazing how many people will debate that as if the integrity of Scripture depended on it. I mean, if you want to argue about Deuteronomy actually being written during the times of the kingdom, I'm going to argue with that. These are the words of Moses, right? Jesus said they were the words of Moses. I'm going to argue with that. But I'm not going to argue with somebody about at what point during Deuteronomy did Joshua start writing. Because even if Joshua wrote down the whole book, all he did is write down what Moses said out loud, right? Much like much like the apostle Paul is the inspired author of 13 epistles and only one of them did he write with his own hand. Does that make sense? Could have been Caleb for all we know. Um, Joshua just seems more likely because the most ancient tradition of the Jews and Christians has always been that Joshua wrote 34 because he was the next biblical writer after Moses. But it very well could have been Caleb for all we know. Yeah. And he also gives us a little bit of a time marker in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 4. It says, after he had slain Sihon, the king of the Amorites, which dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, which dwelt at Astarah in Edrei. Um, so he gives us a bit of a timing. He says, okay, so this is after the events at the end of Numbers. So we know that this book is in the correct chronological place. Okay. Um, verse 5, on this side Jordan in the land of Moab. So they're not yet in Israel, they're in Moab. And who are the Moabites? Who are the people of Moab? Where did they come from? Lot, right? Lot and his daughter. So the Moabites are cousins of the Israelites. Lot and Jacob uh, Lot and Isaac were first cousins. Lot and Jacob were first cousins once removed. These are a cousin branch of Abraham's family. Okay. Um, After he had slain Sihon, the king of the Amorites, after he had slain Og, the king of Bashan, on this side Jordan, in the land of Moab, began Moses to declare this law, saying, The Lord our God spake unto us in Horeb, saying, Ye have dwelt long enough in this mount. It's interesting that he points out that God said that. Ye have dwelt long enough in this mount. 40 years later, they still didn't go and get the land. Turn you and take your journey, and go to the mount of the Amorites, and unto all the places nigh thereto, in the plain, and in the hills, and in the vale, and in the south, and by the seaside, to the land of the Canaanites, and unto Lebanon, unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Behold, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give unto them and to their seed after them. And I spake unto you at that time, saying, I am not able to bear you myself alone. The Lord your God hath multiplied you. And so he goes on and he explains to them in great detail how they got where they are. But I think it's interesting. You remember earlier I said that this is not only the moral law and the religious law, but this is also the constitution of the new nation of Israel, the Magna Carta, the societal contract, the written plan of government. Look what it says in verse 12. How can I myself alone bear your cumbrance and your burden and your strife? Take you wise men and understanding, and know among your tribes, and I will make them rulers over you. And he answered me and said, The thing which thou hast spoken is good for us to do. So I took the chief of your tribes, wise men and known, and made them heads over you, captain over thousands, and captains over hundreds, and captains over fifties, and captains over tens, and officers among your tribes. And I charged your judges at that time, saying, Hear the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between every man and his brother, and the stranger that is with him. Ye shall not respect persons in judgment, but ye shall hear the small as well as the great. Ye shall not be afraid of the face of men, for the judgment is God's, and the cause that is too hard for you, bring it unto me, and I will hear it. And I commanded you at that time all the things which we should do. So, there's more detail throughout this book and in the previous two books, or three books, but I think it's important to point out what Moses has just described is, as you've heard me say before, the first federation of 13 independent republics. Each of these tribes is governed along republican principles. Their leaders are chosen as representatives by the people, for the people, and of the people. There is a national government, a federal government, if you will, that exists for the purpose of handling difficult questions and gathering the people in time of war for mutual defense. But for the most part, the tribes are self governing, sovereign, independent, autonomous, functional republics with a constitution that is written by God Himself. And they still messed it up. And they still couldn't make it work. Why? Because people. If you could only have a country that wasn't run by people, right? All right, so in Deuteronomy chapter 1, he goes on and he tells them how they came to Kadesh Barnea in verse 19, how they were preparing to enter the land. They sent out the tribes, they sent out the spies from every tribe. 12 men went to spy in Canaan, 10 were bad, and 2 were good. And they rebelled, verse 26, notwithstanding you would not go up, but rebelled against the commandment of the Lord your God. Ouch. And then there were consequences. And they wanted to turn around and say, well, let's go and try again. And I warned you not to do it, but you got yourselves beaten because you wouldn't listen. And you returned and wept before the Lord, but the Lord would not hearken to your voice, nor give ear unto you. So ye abode in Kadesh many days, according unto the days that ye abode there. Chapter 2 begins, Then we turned and took our journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea, as the Lord spake unto me, and we compassed Mount Seir many days. And so the Israelites are taken on a retrospective tour of the wilderness wanderings by Moses. In chapter 2 and in chapter 3, he talks about the peoples that they encountered, the ones who were good to them, the ones who were not, the ones that they fought with, and eventually he comes down at the end of chapter 2 to when Sihon came out against them and the Israelites did battle with Sihon. And then he begins chapter 3 with Og, the king of Bashan, he and all his people who did battle with the Israelites at Edrei. And as he finishes this tale, it is interesting to me that Deuteronomy does not mention a prominent person in the story of Moses and the Israelites battling in the wilderness. He does not mention anyone. There's a prophet of God, hired by the enemies of Israel to curse them. His name was Balaam. But when Moses retells the story to this generation, he just doesn't even mention Balaam. Not because it doesn't matter, not because it's not important. It's important enough to be included in Numbers, but because it's not really that important to the story. Moses is reminding the Israelites that they could have been born in the promised land instead of in the wilderness, but their fathers and mothers rebelled against God. And so this generation was born in the wilderness. And then in chapter 4, he really gets into the fact that these people, these people are going to be um, uh, given the second chance. They're going to have the opportunity to have children in the promised land, to raise crops and livestock in the promised land. And what are we going to do about it? But what's interesting is when we get into chapter 4, now all of a sudden, in chapter 4, verse 3, Moses suddenly remembers Baal and what happened because of Baal Peor. And he takes them back to Numbers chapter 25. I don't know if you have your Bibles handy, but in Numbers 25, he speaks to them about, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, what happened because of Baal Peor. And in Numbers 25, that is exactly what is described. And Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. He doesn't bother to worry about Baal Peor being hired by the enemies of Israel or leading them astray. But when the enemies, but when the Israelites had been seduced by the false prophet themselves and began to worship the false gods, that's when Moses said, "This is worthy of note." There's always going to be prophets who are profiteering, and there's always going to be prophets who are false. There's going to be teachers who will come and go. It's only when the people of God join themselves to the enemies of God that it causes hardship because of chastening to the people of God. Okay? So Moses goes on in chapter 4 and he warns them about the consequences of disobedience, and he reminds them about the things that happened to his to the previous generation in the wilderness. In the end of this chapter 4, though, he goes on and he speaks about the cities of refuge. In verse 41 through 49, he speaks about how there is an opportunity for the people if they have killed someone and they want to flee because they didn't do it on purpose or because they did it in a fit of rage and they want to have an opportunity to plead their case, they can flee to the city of refuge so that the avenger of blood will not be able to follow them there and seek revenge. They can wait essentially until their case can be heard or until the death of the high priest. So he gives them cities to flee to. There's Bezer in the wilderness, in the plain country of the Reubenites, Ramoth in Gilead of the Gadites, and Golan in Bashan of the Manassites. Then he goes on and he talks about the testimonies, the statutes, and the judgments. And he talks about the valley over against Beth Peor in the land of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and where the law was given. And he speaks to them about the law, the part of the promised land that they already have on the east of Jordan. And then he begins in chapter 5, verse 1, to get into the laws of God. Okay. Chapter 5, the law of love is expounded to the people in chapters 5 through 11. Does anyone have any comments or questions on the first sermon, the failure of the previous generation, before we move on? No? Okay. So, chapter 5 is about hearing, learning, and doing, and the Ten Commandments are repeated. In verse 1, he says, "And Moses called all Israel and said unto them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that ye may learn them and keep and do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. The Lord made this covenant with our fathers, but with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. The Lord talked with you face to face in the mount out of the midst of the fire. I stood between the Lord and you at that time to show you the word of the Lord, for ye were afraid by reason of the fire, and went not up into the mount. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me." We went through the Ten Commandments when we went through Exodus chapter 20, so I won't get into each of them in great detail, but there is something I'd like to point out. In Exodus chapter 20, there is something that is not written that we do find in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. Honor thy father and thy mother, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee, that thy days may be prolonged, and that it may go well with thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. In Exodus, Moses records the command, but in Deuteronomy, he records the promise. You may recall that in Ephesians chapter 6, this promise is specifically referenced, right? And ye children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And he goes on to say, this is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. I think this is important because, again, this is the law of love. All law comes from the law of love. Honor thy father and thy mother. Isn't it interesting how many emotional, mental, and physical health problems can be attributed to not honoring your mother or not honoring your father in your heart, in your attitude, in your feelings, in your behavior, right? Um, the things that our parents do can be very damaging to us, but it's actually our response to them that determines our spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical wellness. Our wellness is not determined by what our parents did or didn't do, but by our response to them. That it may be well with thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. Okay. Ver- and it's so interesting to me that Paul reached back for that promise in the letter to the Ephesian church, that it may be well with thee. Right. All right, verse 22. These words the Lord spake unto all your assembly in the mount out of the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick darkness with a great voice. And he added no more, and he wrote them in 2 tables of stone, and delivered them unto me. So the Ten Commandments are restated. The Decalogue, often called the foundation of law and justice in the civilized world. Okay. Um, in chapter 6, we see that loving God produces godly character. And you'll notice in chapter 6, you have verses 4 and 5, the Shema of Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. I've often wondered if in English there should be a comma after um, after the one in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, comma, Jehovah. In Hebrew, they don't have the same kind of markings that we have, punctuation markings, but especially in very ancient Hebrew. But the reason I wonder that is because um, it's not Adonai or Adon. It's not Lord. It's YHWH. It's Jehovah. It's Yahweh. That's what it says. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Yahweh. As in, the Lord our God is not many gods. He's not even three gods. He's one, and his name is Yahweh. Just something I wonder. Uh, Something like that. So of course it doesn't have any vowels, right? Um, Yahweh or Jehovah. Um, the idea that is often proposed is that they took the vowels out of um, Adonai. The problem is the there were no vowels in ancient Hebrew at all. So the original form of Adonai didn't have vowels either. So um, I'm not entirely sure that theory can be proven, but it is an ancient tradition among the Hebrews that they got the vowels out of Adonai to create Jehovah. Um, the No, it's really more of an ancient Hebrew legend. I wouldn't even necessarily. It's more than a myth, but less than a fact. So I will call it a legend. Um, no, the Hebrews will not speak the name of God. They will replace Jehovah with either they will say the name, they will call it the Tetranonomicron, which means the name that has four letters, or they will say Adonai instead of Jehovah. They will not say the name of God. They won't pronounce it. Yeah. No. Jehovah is the sure. So Jehovah is what happens when you take the Hebrew uh, Yahweh and you transliterate it from Hebrew into Aramaic, from Aramaic into Greek, from Greek into Latin, and from Latin into English. And and you can see the Germanic influence of English because it's not um, Yehovah, it's Jehovah. So the J would not be there in Latin. It would be an I. Yehovah, but in English, because of the Germanic influence, it's a J, Jehovah. Well, it is found in the original text. Um, it would be like saying Abraham does not appear in the original text. Well, the spelling of Abraham in English is an anglicized version of the Hebrew name Abram. Um, that's the reason there are alternate spellings in different books of the Bible for the same person, because you're dealing with names that have been translated, transliterated, passed down from one language to another, and you'll find that, for example, often the New Testament, because it's using Greek and then being translated into English, and the Old Testament because it's using Hebrew or Aramaic and then being translated into English, the same person's name will be spelled differently. That's why Jesus is called Jesus and not Joshua, when in fact neither is actually his name. Yeshua is his name. But what we see in the Old Testament is YHWH, and then the vowel sounds that are added essentially give us Yahweh. Hmm. So here's an interesting thing that yeah, really, it's so what the Jehovah's Witnesses have started this ridiculous conspiracy theory that the Roman Catholic Church changed the name of God from Yahweh or Jehovah to Lord. They didn't want us to know the name of God. It's actually completely absurd and historically inaccurate. The the reality is this, okay? Um, the tradition of taking the name of God and translating it instead of calling it Yahweh, translating it um, into another language as Lord actually comes from the Septuagint. During the time of the men of Alexander, when the uh, Old Testament scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, were translated into Greek, they did not want to translate the name of God, so they replaced it, much as they had done in reading out loud for centuries. They replaced it. What they replaced it with is the Greek word kyrios. Another form is kyrie. Every bad Greek student who flunked out in the first 3 months knows that kyrios means Lord or Master. Okay, that's the first thing. As far as we can, as far as we can tell from the Gospels, there not yet. There's still time. Um, the uh, the Gospels record every single time Jesus quoted an Old Testament passage in which the name of God, Yahweh or Jehovah, appears. Jesus used the word Kyrios at least in the translation by the inspired author, right? Every time the apostles quote the Old Testament, they use the Greek word kyrios. Every time the New Testament quotes an Old Testament passage where the name of God, Yahweh, appears, it uses the Greek word kyrios. So the Jehovah's Witness conspiracy theory is completely bankrupt of any facts because they're going to have to say that somehow they got the ancient Jewish translators and scribes to participate before the time of Jesus. They got Jesus and the apostles to participate, and they got the Holy Spirit to participate in the conspiracy of the Catholic Church 300 plus years before the Catholic Church existed. So um, the reality is the name of God is Yahweh, but clearly, from the fact that the New Testament translated it Lord, it's okay for us to translate it Lord too. Oh, wow. It's 2:05, y'all. It's 2 o'clock, y'all. We have 5 minutes left. Um, and we're in chapter 6. All right. Um, in chapter 6, I want to point out one more thing. That's verse 18. And thou shalt do that which is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest go in and possess the good land which the Lord sware unto thy fathers. Chapter 6, verse 18. So that it may be well with thee, that same promise is found again in chapter 6. Do that which is right and good in the sight of the Lord, instead of that which is right every man in his own eyes. Do that which is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may be well with thee. And I'll leave you with this question to ponder. Is it well with thee? Do you find that there are fractures in your psyche, in your soul? Are you broken? Are you do you have trouble in relationships? Do you have trouble surrendering to authority? Are you are you afraid of being hurt? Is it well with thee? If not, two relationships you should look at. One is your relationship with your heavenly Father, and the other is your relationship with your earthly parents, even if your earthly parents are dead. Because unresolved problems, unresolved lack of honoring in those three relationships that are the foundation of your self worth, your identity, and your relationships with all other people, if you have cracks in that foundation, it's going to manifest in the house that you build that you call your life. So if it's not well with thee, it might be time to do some amends or some forgiving with your earthly mom and dad, and it might be time to take a look at your relationship with your heavenly Father. And I don't mean to sound like a psychiatrist who just repeats the last two words that you say in the form of a question. Your mother. Hmm. But the reality is this. No, some things have to do with dad or your father in heaven. And some things just have to do with yourself, right? So just just a little free extra from Moses this morning. If it's not well with thee, here are some places you can check. Any comments or questions before we break for the day? Try to finish Deuteronomy, maybe get into Joshua tomorrow. Hmm. Are you thinking about doing it in a format kind of like this? Are you thinking about doing one hosted at your church or cool? Indeed.